Hello, good morning, and welcome to the first Monday forum for the Public Diplomacy Council of America of 2026. And Happy New Year to everybody. Uh, it's a pleasure to welcome two speakers this morning, Kevin Maloney and Jim Ketterer. And I will say a little bit about what we'll be doing this morning and then hand things over to them. I'm Nick Cull from the University of Southern California. This session came about because in August 2025, a really interesting report was published by the Carnegie Council on International Ethics, written by Kevin and Jim. It was called Illiberal Narratives and Shifting Values, Examining Competing Visions of the US and its Role in the World. And it seemed to be placing at the top of the agenda issues that I think always have to underlie discussion of public diplomacy. And so it seemed to me that it would be a good idea to have the authors present. Now, I didn't, of course, couldn't have known in advance how important issues of ethics and norms of behavior would be in the first week of 2026. But I think it's a particularly important moment to check on these issues, take the pulse of these issues. Our first speaker will be Kevin, who's Director of Communications at the Carnegie Council. His background includes he was educated at Fordham and King's College London, and he hosts a podcast called Values and Interests, and has done a lot of work on issues around ethics in international relations since his current post. And following Kevin, we'll hear from Jim. Now, Jim really works both sides of the shop. He's a professor at Bard, where he directs their international programs. So he's both teaching international relations and public diplomacy, and is also arranging international exchanges and international educational work. And previous to being at Bard, his background includes time at Amid East, and he's been particularly involved in work in the Middle East region. If you are interested in going further with what Jim and Kevin are talking about today, they did an interview with Bill Wayland in the newsletter that you can follow up on. But without further ado, let me pass the microphone to Kevin to kick off the session.
Thanks so much, Nick, and thanks to the Public Diplomacy Council of America, and it's great to be here and speaking with the community. So, I wanted to start perhaps to maybe provide a little bit of background on Carnegie Council, and then a few framing points on our narrative project. I'm sure we'll interrogate and discuss those points together today, especially in light of the recent events over the last 48, 72 hours. So the long form version of our institution's name is the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. And as the name suggests, we examine moral questions within geopolitics. And so we're over 100 years old, but in the context of kind of post-World War II America, we're very much informed by thinkers such as Hans Morgenthau, Reinhold Niebuhr, the late Dr. Joseph Nye. And we at the Council approach international relations through this lens of ethical realism. And so, what do I mean by ethical realism? So, for us, it's the idea that power and morality are not mutually exclusive. Instead, these things must shape and inform one another, especially within liberal democracies. So, for ethical realists, morality should be grounded in political reality, not discarded in its name. And so, one way we assess this dynamic is to analyze a state's values alongside its national interests. and really how these two can interact in the practice of foreign policy. And if I kind of think about this moment where questions of morality and national interests were really kind of deeply thought about post World War II, Hans Morgenthau writes in 1950, and he really kind of captures this values and interest interplay in this quote. And he writes, "The choice is not between moral principles and the U.S. national interest, devoid of moral dignity, but between one set of moral principles divorced from political reality and another set of moral principles derived from political reality." So this really goes again to the realism aspect, but that you can't divorce realism from values, especially within a democracy that purports to align with liberal values. And so then switching to kind of the narrative project of the council, which was formed early last year, it was really put together to look at this or to interrogate what we saw as this liberal to illiberal shift happening in values-based U.S. foreign policy discourse. And just, I guess, a few framing remarks on that transition overall, and then I'll hand it over to Jim. So, from our perspective, post World War II America, in a lot of ways, we see this tension between moral idealism informed by liberal values and political realism. And we argue that this interplay manifested in the policies of U.S. presidents and their and their public narratives they constructed. Um, and they were constructed and projected to justify actions and advance geopolitical goals. Now, these narratives, we argue, reflected a high level bipartisan values consensus, which sought to align national interests and liberal values such as peace, freedom, and pluralism with associated principles of action such as sovereignty, democracy, and multilateralism. So today, we argue that liberal values consensus has fractured. And so this is happening in kind of two ways. Um, we talk about the Trump administration right now in particular. And so they are trying to kind of redefine what constitutes a moral approach to US foreign policy. And as I said, this is happening in two ways through narratives. So the first is that the Trump administration's foreign policy discourse and kind of related strategic narratives, first, it aggressively challenges the efficacy vis-a-vis U.S. national interests of liberal values and the associated principles I laid out before. So one such example of this, and you can kind of draw a straight line to the action of the last 72 hours, is that a few months ago you have Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. He's in the Oval Office with President Trump, and they're talking about renaming the Department of Defense to the Department of War. And Secretary Hegseth has this line where he says, "We are going to focus on maximum lethality, not tepid legality." And his comments are just one example of discourse by various officials that feed into this larger administration-wide narrative that minimizes the importance of human rights and international law, while also prioritizing a more kinetic and efficient form of amoral hard power, unencumbered by liberal values and related ethical concerns. The second way this is happening, and often in concert with what I just outlined above, is that the Trump administration is seeking to redefine and or obfuscate the very meaning of specific liberal values such as freedom of speech. And so a really prime example of this is Vice President J.D. Vance's 2025 Munich Security Conference speech, where he argues that the liberal governments of Europe, not Russia, not Hungary, etc., are the ones that pose the real threat to shared Western values such as freedom of speech. And so Vance's narrative approach here, and this is very important, recognizes the normative political value of liberal concepts for both domestic and international audiences, while also seeking to redefine and reshape said concepts as a means to help, I would say, construct a post-liberal political system. So there is significant, I would say, narrative values gaslighting happening right now around liberal values, their very meaning, and how they are deployed within U.S. foreign policy. And so I'll leave it there in terms of Carnegie Council and kind of the framing in this liberal to a liberal moment from a narrative perspective, and maybe then pass it over to Jim before we open it up to Nick for a larger conversation.
As they say on Top Gear, and on that bombshell. Very good. Thanks a lot, Kevin. Jim.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks, Kevin. I've been involved with the Carnegie Council for many years, so it's really been a pleasure to be involved with this project, which is ongoing. The report that Nick mentioned that we put out in August of 2025, we've done public events, we've had subsequent working sessions, and more to come, and there's a lot more to come. So please do follow it online because I think it's highly relevant to this audience. I'm happy to be a fairly recently anointed member of the PDCA, and so it's good to be involved with the organization in this way too on this panel. I just want to update one thing that Nick said about my bio, not to be to just correct him for the sake of it, because I think it's relevant to this conversation. So I'm no longer the Dean of International Studies at Bard because I'd left for a few years and turned over that position to somebody else, and I went to the American University in Cairo. And I worked there for the president, who's a former Foreign Service officer, Frank Ricciardone. And I oversaw a school there that interacted a great deal with the public affairs section in U.S. Embassy Cairo, as I also did when I was the country director in Egypt for Ahmadiyist, when I worked for Ambassador Ted Kattouf, and I was there during and immediately after the Egyptian Revolution. And so I have worked on and alongside a lot of public diplomacy initiatives. And that I say all that because I think that experience, and I also worked for NSC during the Clinton administration, that what brings me to this project, I think, is my experience with and my interest in institutions and the ways in which institutions intersect with the many things that Kevin was talking about. And particularly, one of those experiences was when I worked at the State University of New York. I oversaw a center that was working on democracy and governance projects for USAID. And my first day on the job was September 10th, 2001. So obviously the next day it turned into something quite different. Also, my boss for those many years that I worked there was Bob Gasende, who I know many of you know. And when he left USIA and he came to SUNY, he really set up what was essentially a public diplomacy operation. And so when I was working on what were going to be these many post 9/11 USAID projects, I was doing so with the guidance and the mentorship and the experience of Bob, who brought to bear all that he had learned in the field of public diplomacy and the idea that values were at the core of it. The values were the starting point of these programs. They weren't just programs for the sake of it. They weren't just programs for the sake of the funding, but they were programs that needed to, one way or another, be reflecting the values of both the institution we worked for, the university, but also the United States. And I think that as a starting point, my own starting point with this project, kind of, the relationship values to institutions, to the purpose and the mission of these institutions, eventually to the specific programs and policies, and to personnel and to the ways that played out over the course of many decades. Certainly not always perfect, certainly not always pretty, but there was a bipartisan understanding. There was, for many decades, a general reliance on the kinds of values and the narratives that were created via those values that Kevin was discussing. So it's really the institutions that brings me to this. It has been, quite interesting to also discuss all of this with a wide variety of different groups, including this one, in the times in which we live. But I also think that it's important to put it into the broader historical context. And I also think it's important to put it into the broader global context that what we're discussing, what I think is important for our project going forward, but important for the broader understanding of the phenomenon that we're facing is to also see that whatever's happening in Washington right now is part and parcel of broader global trends, and that preceded the current administration and are likely to go on following this administration, and also are manifesting themselves in similar but still distinctly different ways in different parts of the world. So I'll leave it at that, but I would just say that one of the things that Kevin and I, strongly believe in is that we also, although our working sessions have been at the Carnegie Council in New York, and we've published some things flowing out of there, that I think these kinds of conversations we're having today, kind of conversations we've had with World Affairs Council members and others, that these are absolutely essential because I strongly believe that one of the things that didn't had happened, but it didn't happen enough over time, was an explanation to the American people and to broader publics about the importance of public diplomacy, the importance of soft power. What is it? Why is it? Why does it matter? And though we're in the midst of extremely challenging times in general and for the practice of public diplomacy, I think that that kind of message bears stating and restating and reaching new audiences over and over and over again.
Very good. Do you want to just w- so say something about what you think the bottom line for policy should be from the report? What should the administration take away from this discussion? How should things uh, be different? Uh, for me right now, I'm feeling that so many of the things that we thought of as the points of entry into thinking and talking about international relations are being questioned. I feel a bit like a triceratops after the meteor struck, and thinking, how do we keep doing what we've always been doing? It seems that points you're making in this report are so far adrift from the kind of language that's being used and the kind of policies that are actually now being put forward. There's precedent for what happened with Venezuela, but I can't think of a modern precedent in US policy for intimidating Denmark and saying that the US is going to take Greenland. How do we have a discussion about ethics when these sorts of things are being put forward?
Kevin, that's an easy question, so I'll throw that to you.
Yeah, no, sorry, it's on mute. So, I mean, I think we have to take a step back and don't not look at the noise day in and day out, but really think about how do we interrogate values, right? Because a lot of what we do at the council is provide frameworks through ethics to do that, right? There are always going to be competing value systems, right? So one country might have their value system, another might have another. There is, precedent in the past 80 years to embrace a universality to a certain extent from a moral perspective around the equal human rights and equal moral worth of every individual. And that has been kind of a framework that has informed international aid, U.S. foreign policy, albeit with some glaring contradictions. But I think, as people who are aligned with liberal values, not from a political perspective, but from a moral perspective, it's important to take a step back and interrogate different value systems and try to find points of compromise. Obviously, in politics, there are going to be good faith and bad faith actors who are only engaging in that values discussion as a bad faith means to an illiberal political end. But I do think that there is an inundation right now in terms of performative discourse, policy action that is rewarded in terms of eyeballs, clicks, etc. There needs to be more good faith forums to deeply interrogate values differences that don't end up with othering the person in a zero-sum political or military way. And so there are many good faith actors out there. I think there are good faith actors in both political parties, but the reward structure is not prioritizing them right now, either politically, monetarily, power-wise, etc. The pendulum can swing back. This takes a lot of work. This takes good faith actors who want to come together and agree to disagree, but still understand that we can have a North Star that is America based on certain principles that, although we're not going to agree on every single policy, the principles are there and they are sacrosanct to an extent, and they flow from universal moral worth of every individual. They flow from pluralism, right? Some of these things are non-negotiables in many ways. And so maybe I'll pause there because Jim has much more experience, but I guess that's kind of the high level framing about how we think about it at the council.
Thank you.
Yeah, just would add, as I was thinking about your question, Nick, I was thinking back to our first two sessions of the working groups that we had at the Carnegie Council, and that we had an incredible array of people there for multiple hours on each of these days behind closed doors, Chatham House rule, so people could really open up and discuss things, and with some framing by Kevin and me, but not specific guidance on a direction forward. And what I found noteworthy in both sessions is that people who were there from the policy world, from the NGO world, from universities and other practitioner organizations, that they were very, very much looking for ways to think about your question, Nick. So what, not just what now amidst this very challenging time, but how can we think about new institutions? How can we think about new policies and new ways to construct narratives that justify these institutions going forward, whenever that going forward might be, and institutions that wouldn't simply replicate what had been the case before. I personally think, I think probably many people in this audience think that it was an enormous mistake to do away with USIA back in those days. And I think it was a huge mistake to do away with USAID, and a huge mistake to do away with it, certainly in the way in which that was done. But that's not to say that institutions couldn't be rethought, reformed, whatever. We know that there were specific attempts. During the Clinton administration, USAID was in the bullseye for a while. We know that when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and the QDDR effort sought, very serious reformations of USAID, and those were largely, only moderately successful at best. And so, how to think about reforming, rethinking, and putting together new institutions that would be fit for current times, but also be flexible and resilient and more open to change over time. Because I think, any of us who have worked in large and unforgiving institutions know that when they become too rigid and sclerotic, that really can be a death knell for the institution itself. So I was really pleased to see that without any prompting from Kevin or from me, that people in these working groups were thinking along those lines. Another thing that I think is important is the kinds of things that can be the noise and are certainly important, but are at the highest level of the government enterprise. But if we think about in the world in which I've operated for much of my life on specific projects and specific policies that create those projects and monitor them and rethink them and retool them, I think about some of the projects that I saw. I was back in Egypt a couple of months ago and visited with a lot of my old friends and colleagues, and I saw still operating some of the projects that I think are just public diplomacy gold, like the English Access Micro Scholarship Program, such a mouthful of a name, but Access Program. This, for high school students, this is the kind of program that I think really is underscored by the kinds of values that resonate with people across the political spectrum and are, you couldn't come up with a program that I think is better designed to promote the best of the United States and do it in a way that's highly effective, which is why that it exists in so many countries and at least as far as I know up to this moment still does exist. The reason I say that is that to take the kind of tangible elements of a program like that and do what I was saying before is to reach out to audiences and not just preach to the converted, but to try to reach audiences that are skeptical, audiences maybe that simply don't know or they know some things and they're highly skeptical of the value of public diplomacy, of the value of diplomacy in general, and to talk about, well, here's a specific example and how it works specifically and how it has been successful over time in a variety of different places, including many places that are not overflowing with love of American foreign policy. I think that kind of effort is also something that, for my purposes, flows from the work that we've been doing. The kind of advice that I would give if I had that opportunity.
Thanks, Jim. So I'd like to go now to questions, and I'll sort of address them as they seem relevant to the ongoing discussion. So the first question comes from Sherry Mueller, who asks, what are some ways that we can educate the US public about the importance of learning more about international relations, and in particular, the importance of soft power? Are there examples where this is being done in addition to the report?
So I'll just mention another organization called the Metropolitan Group that has just released a very interesting report looking at the impact of values-based discourse and values-based narratives across multiple countries that were at risk for democratic backsliding. And I just think it's an amazing resource. I'll try to pull it up and put it in the chat. But it's amazing for two reasons. One, it showcases the value of values-based discourse and the value of individual values-based discourse in specific cultures and countries, and how there is a universality attached to them and how they work and how the narratives echo themselves in different countries, whether it's Kenya or Ecuador or fill in the blank. And so it's a really interesting report. I think that there is more on the ground education required in terms of interest in international relations, to talk about the cost of not being engaged or not being knowledgeable about international relations, especially in what we're seeing at the council in this moment of massive transition of the international system. Right? Kind of we talk about this in our meetings at the council, but the assumption that the system was going to continue as is, I think was a risk that we talked a lot about. And it's more important than ever to be educated in terms of international relations because the consequences are going to be felt, right? I as a young father, this is something on top of my mind. Obviously, I'm working in the in the space, but in the past, it's just not something that would be as front of mind. It's a really I'm going to use dire. It's a From an international relations IR research perspective, it's a very interesting moment. There will be significant human level consequences, both domestic and internationally, for what is happening over these next few years in terms of reshaping an international system that's going through a moment of transition.
So we can go straight into the next question, which is
Nick,
from
can I just
Robert.
say something
Oh yeah,
about that
sure.
question, that answer that question a little bit? Sorry to cut you off,
No,
but
no, no, that's all right.
the I mentioned it briefly in my opening comments, but I want to just double down on the idea that I think two organizations across the country are really highly valuable as a way to reach out to a broader public. Now, they're sort of a self-selected public, but we can talk about that too. And that's the World Affairs Councils across the country, and also the American Committees on Foreign Relations. And since I've been back from Egypt after a 4-year stint there for a couple of years. I've been going around and speaking to both versions of these groups across the country. Mostly, I've gone out to talk to them about something that I've been doing a lot of work on jazz diplomacy, but it opens up conversations about public diplomacy in general. And I find that even with these self-selected groups, people who have already identified themselves as someone who's interested in something international, however defined, that a lot of the speakers they have coming to them are, there to talk about kind of, very high-level geostrategic issues. They have a lot of kind of retired military officers and other officials who talk about those kinds of issues. But to have somebody come in and talk about, the kinds of programs I was just mentioning, that English Access Micro Scholarship Program or something like that, these folks tend to know nothing at all about that. They don't know that it exists. They don't know why it exists. They don't know what it does, and they don't know why it's valuable to them, to their communities. And I mean, that access program is just one example. But I think using the infrastructure of programs like that, I think a lot of the people who are involved in these World Affairs Councils are also likely to then go and spread that good news to other people in their community. And so I think that's one way to get at it. It still has the problem of preaching to the converted for the most part, but it's I think it's at least getting outside of, the Beltway and Manhattan.
Following on a question from Robert Ogborn, what are your recommendations to a new generation of public affairs officers and press officers in the field and in Washington, and to their counterparts at ally/partner foreign ministries? So, how can this be operationalized?
Jim, I'll let you take that.
Yeah, I mean that is, in the immediate aspect of it, I think it's certainly difficult to imagine that a lot of public affairs officers are going to do something that's counter to the prevailing narrative from the government. I mean, they're just not in a position to be able to do that. But I think they are in a position to do is, as it relates to specific programs, the operations of specific programs, the feedback that they can garner from those programs and send back to Washington, the feedback that they can get from those programs to visiting CODELs. I mean, I can't tell you the number of times in both of my jobs in Egypt where I was asked by the embassy to present students in access or teacher training people, or we were running a project at Al Azhar University, the oldest Sunni Islamic university in the world, one of the oldest universities in the world. And you really wouldn't kind of intuitively think that the United States government would be supporting the American University in Cairo to run an English language resource center in the heart of the Al Azhar campus. But we did, and when we would have CODELs come and we would not only present the project, but talk about its underpinnings and talk about its results in a way that resonated with those audiences, and do so in coordination with the PAO and their staff. I think that's highly valuable. I still think that there are people on both sides of the aisle in both houses of Congress who care about these kinds of programs and who care about that kind of feedback. And so I think continuing to send that back from posts is incredibly important.
I'll just also make another comment in terms of not not providing a solution, but I guess recognizing the current situation, especially with traditional US allies. So if you think about Western Europe, right, the values and interests equation when you go public affairs to public affairs was kind of set in stone for a while, right? There might be policy disagreements, but I think about this at Carnegie Council in terms of kind of the pluralistic sandbox from a US democracy perspective, or the liberal international order sandbox from an international relations perspective, right? There used to be guardrails, rules, right? We'll have our disagreements, but we'll have it in the sandbox to a certain extent. If you look at the national security strategy, I mean, there's a line from it. There are many lines that jump out to me, but one of them, the security strategy writes, we want to support our allies in preserving the freedom and security of Europe while restoring Europe's civilizational self-confidence and Western identity. And so this is a civilizational erasure narrative, right? And it's they're confronting them, right? They're poking the bear, right? Like that is the point of this. Can't really take that language any other way. And so, you know, I think that especially with traditional allies, one moment you get a comment on Denmark, and another moment you get the threat to sue the BBC. Now that's not an overarching narrative. That's discourse that are going to larger narratives that we talked about before, but I mean, I do not envy those. I hate to not be prescriptive, but I do not envy those in that situation right now, U.S. public affairs or their counterparts, in attempting to operate in a new sandbox that seems to be changing by the day. And so I think that is a huge challenge right now. Um, Apart from maybe on a personal level, I'm speaking for other people, feeling, comfort through values, through a values-based community, right? Whether it's international or your local school board, right? There is comfort there because values speak to an institutional or country level, but they also speak to you personally. And so when those are significantly disrupted, shaken up, relationships built upon those, and they're changed and they're attempted to be obfuscated or replaced, this is very difficult to deal with. It's a very difficult playing field. It's a very difficult sandbox right now. So apologies for not being prescriptive in
No,
terms of the
no.
question, but I think it's important to underline that.
Eric Manton asks, in times when America is positioning itself opposite of where it was for decades after World War II, alienating traditional partners from the liberal world, mainly Europe, where do you see possible transatlantic solidarity? Where can that thrive and survive until we enter a more cooperative phase? So, what can American audiences do to maintain the relationship?
So this is, and I'll let Jim weigh in here, but this is a real tension point from an ethics perspective, right? So if you gave kind of the direct response to that is you find ways to build a relationship around transactionalism, right? You're seeing this more and more. Transactionalism is rewarded. From an ethics perspective, I take the approach that reciprocity based on values and trust over time will last much longer and get you more than one that is purely based on transactionalism, right? So, this is a balancing act. Again, applied ethics allows you to do this in terms of understanding that you can't think about international relations just in a zero-sum framework. You're thinking about trade-offs around ends and means and consequences, as Joseph Nye laid out in his book, Do Morals Matter? And Three-Dimensional Ethics. And so this is the big question here. Like, how far do you go along to get along in terms of transactionalism without violating kind of core values of your institution or your state, et cetera? And this is playing out on multiple levels right now. Ethics does not provide a yes or no, good or bad answer, right? It provides a framework to reckon with these non-zero sum questions, and to do it through a moral framework, not just do it through an economic or a power framework. And so again, sorry, the irony of ethics, right, is that it is prescriptive to a point. And so I would just underline that, in that if you are kind of work through this right now, you have to think about the trade-offs of being maybe overly transactional if that violates your values at the state or institutional level to a certain point.
I also think that it's useful to think about other institutions in the United States and other parts of the world that embody those values and have been a key part of public diplomacy because of that, So I think about the role of universities and colleges and the ways in which universities and colleges can maintain and, in fact, even increase and enhance the links that they have with partner institutions around the world, and to try to find ways to navigate that at a time when it's really challenging to do so. I think that the program like Education USA has been highly valuable in being part of the ways in which students are attracted to come to the United States. But that task, I think, has become very, very difficult now. We can see the latest IIE numbers that incoming, the first time coming international students are down 17%. And so, that is really existentially highly problematic for many American institutions of higher education. At the same time, I think we can see the beginnings of, rather than kind of a zero-sum competition among these institutions of higher education with partners in Canada and Europe and other places, to try to find ways in which programs can be established that would be beneficial to both sides, and try to navigate around what is happening in Washington that is so problematic for these institutions. It's a lot easier said than done, and I think the devil is in the details in how you make that work. But to see, I think, to see higher education kind of all in the same boat rather than competing against one another on a nation state basis is another kind of example of a way to try to manage the current situation, without, while realizing that it's not an easy fix, that the current situation is going to maintain itself as challenging. So what can these institutions do? And I think that calls it to mind too what Kevin is talking about making decisions at the highest level of these institutions about whether to be transactional or not, and what kinds of decisions to make. And I think that rather than appearing kind of a lonely sentinel against a challenging situation, but to be part of that broader global higher education community is one answer to that challenge.
Jim, you and I both came of age really after 9/11, thinking about how do we maintain dialogue when there are ethically questionable things happening at the highest level. And maybe that provides a model where I felt at that time that it really helped to be able to say, look, not everybody voted for him, not everybody wants this invasion. There are many different ideas within America and many different attitudes. Just to be ourselves and perform a diversity of values can help. Just to show
Yeah,
that this isn't an unquestioned direction in American foreign policy. I'm sure that helped last time.
yeah, and Nick, that's a perfect example of those years immediately following 9/11, and then very, very serious questions and pushback from multiple constituencies around the world on American policy at the highest level. Um, but at the same time, the ability of higher education to navigate that in a way that was still American, but not officially part and parcel
Right.
of American policy. I mean, John Waterbury, who had been at Princeton for a long time and then was the president of the American University in Beirut. He wrote an article for Foreign Affairs a couple years after 9/11 about the role of higher education institutions. And the title says it all: Hate your policies, love your institutions. And I think that our current times are putting that to an even more intense test, but it does lay out a model, as you say, Nick.
So we need to change gear a little. We have a question from Carl Stoltz, who is our co-president. So could you briefly discuss the influence of online disinformation and propaganda on values-based narratives. It seems to be that the algorithms that drive attention online focused on emotional impact and sensationalism and create an overwhelming challenge to more measured values-based decision making and information sharing we've known up to now, and leading to some of the political populism and authoritarianism that we see today.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so we've covered this a lot in the working sessions of
mhm.
the narratives group that we've had at the council. So yeah, so I mean, we think about it from the algorithm rewarding performance, right, and disinformation, and I think that's been reported on a lot. What I want to talk about are kind of two things that were highlighted that were new-ish to me from our working group. So the first one was looking at kind of the framing, and we talk about this in the report, right, in terms of like authoritarianism versus democracy, right? And that kind of being the post-Cold War framing, the post-World War II framing, right? But now you're looking at kind of the international system, the state level, the policy level narratives that are coming out of the administration, and you're seeing a mirror of playbooks that come out of places like Hungary, like China, like Russia, right? So there is this narrative overlap, and we underline this in the report that was unfathomable maybe 10 years ago, right? So like that is happening at a macro US foreign policy level, narrative level. The other side of things, and it was laid out by a member who does deep research on this, is kind of this shadow information ecosystem that is being built in parallel to the current maybe consumer facing information ecosystem, whether it's YouTube, Instagram, etc. Right? So currently there is massive amounts of information being pushed out into LLMs, specifically from autocracies that are never meant for public facing human consumption, right? They are literally flooding LLMs with illiberal narratives and illiberal content to basically lay the groundwork for a post-liberal information ecosystem. So you have these two parallel things happening. You have kind of the poisoning of the current ecosystem that is obfuscating values, fracturing truth, promoting sensationalism, while this other thing is being built on top of that as it is being deregulated.
So
And so you
just
have these two things happening in parallel. And that was a real eye-opening moment for me where there is billions and a strategy going into kind of poisoning the LLM world.
So are you talking there about large language models? So
Exactly.
effectively, if you like, brainwashing the artificial intelligence so that it has so much information from the authoritarian side that it is authoritarian artificial intelligence. Is that what
Correct.
you're?
So it's basically, it's talked about as poisoning the data set, right? But there is, if you think about an equivalent of a consumer-facing media outlet like Russia Today, right? There is an equivalent of that happening just in terms of training data on publicly available in order to influence publicly available LLMs. And so I can actually share something with the group post event from one of our participants that really laid this out nicely.
So the future is Nazi robots. That's that's
I
really
yeah.
well. You
Yes,
heard it
no,
here
it's
first. That's very disturbing. Jim,
Yeah, this is on a much different level, but I think about the challenge of public diplomacy programming, of constructing programming and implementing it in places that are already deeply authoritarian, and trying to include things like critical thinking components, analytical reading, etc., as part and parcel of those programs, even though you're working with participants who are living in a highly authoritarian society, who are subjected to all kinds of misinformation, disinformation, etc., and are hopefully at the age where they might still, be reachable in terms of their attention span and their interest. And so My sense is that that kind of thing has been part of public diplomacy educational programs for a long time, but I think there's an opportunity to rethink how it's done, to really have a sense of the information miasma that these participants are in, and to try to address it, with current challenges in mind, and with those current times in their current times in mind, their current situations in mind. So it's going to adjust probably from place to place to place. But I think it's so it there you are addressing the question of like, well, who's receiving this information? How are they receiving this information? How are they deciding what to read, what not to read, what to question? And particularly in places where their educational systems, their media ecosystems, etc., there's nothing available to them that would give them any sense of critical thinking. There's nothing available to them that would value that, and show them what it really looks like and why it is valuable. I think, making sure that that is a key and valued part of PD programming is all the more important now than it's ever been, particularly given what Kevin just said.
So I want to now jump to shorter questions because we're coming into the final 10 minutes. Lonnie Johnson asks, how will it be possible to meaningfully commemorate the 250th anniversary of the USA without the kind of broader bipartisan political consensus on American values that has previously existed? And this question of a profound division over what the country even means has also come up around the thorny question we have in this group about what happens next for Voice of America. It's like if we can't even agree on what American values are, how can we talk about American values? So can you can you take that one on?
So I'm sure Jim has some thoughts here, much, much, much better than mine. But I just want to talk about this from a council perspective. In terms of kind of two principles that we think deeply about, which I think can be used and kind of put in listeners' toolkit here, whether it's, you work in public affairs or you work at a university, or if you just want to organize something locally, right? So these two kind of principles that we think about are humility and pluralism. And so we think about this in the action of ethics, right? Or the reflection of ethics that we're pluralistic when it comes to ethics itself, right? So there's no one school of thought. Like there's a recognition of universality and difference within that. And pluralism obviously has this DNA within the United States. So I think the more you can do to create environments that are have a sense of humility within them and are organized around pluralism, it provides a very big umbrella, very big tent for people to come into. And so this this is human to human, right? This only happens through good faith people attempting to do this. And so to the question of fracturing of values and fracturing of meaning within the United States, I think we need good faith people to, wave the pluralism flag, right? And showcase that difference is okay and that we can interrogate those differences in a non-zero sum way, right? Like authoritarian regimes and political movements, there's this irony around pluralism, right? They are attempting to fracture any sense of shared values or ideals, while pluralism requires difference to exist, right? And so people do not want to interrogate that nuance, or they want to turn it off and scroll on their phones, right? And kind of other another and say somebody else is their enemy. But if you take a step back, and I would just say those two principles, humility and pluralism, can be applied in multiple ways in the public sphere, whether you're a professional in public affairs or again, you're on your local school board, right? So I will kind of the plug there for the applied ethics at a high level and kind of embracing universality and pluralism.
It's very good.
I,
So
you
I have
know,
a
this question just makes me think too about, I mentioned before that I worked for Bob Gesende, and Bob's stories about serving in Poland, the bicentennial year, and the displays that they put on, and then the exhibitions that they had and other programs that they had that were reflecting American values at a very difficult time in the Cold War, and the ways in which they resonated with Poles who were seeking to operationalize those same kinds of values in their own environment. So now here we are, coming up on 250, and you know, how can such a such a thing even be conceived, as the questioner is stating? How could we put on similar kinds of things where the real intended audience, I think, is not the rest of the world, but is, the constraints of Smith-Mundt Act aside, is the American public itself. And so I don't have any easy answer on how to address that, but unless and until that happens, I agree with the underlying premise behind the question. It's extremely difficult to imagine how we present it to the rest of the world.
So to bring things home, I have a question from Bruce Gregory. PDCA supports the academic study of public diplomacy as well as professional practice. What are your thoughts on how scholars and universities might usefully address these changing values issues in IR and PD in their courses and public forums?
Jim, I'm happy to take that.
You can start, Kevin.
That's always awkward on virtual Zoom, right? Um, so I think it goes to the question of nuance, right? Where can deep research really add value? And I think it is around the kind of conflation of values with liberal values from the US political context, right? So I'm talking about an international relations perspective. So one of the things kind of I talked about in the interview with Bill is being kind of asleep at the wheel for a while and thinking about values again being liberal values in the practice of international relations. But no, the Nazis had a value system, Stalin had a value system, right? Throughout history, there have been value systems, and everybody is competing for the moral high ground. I think there's a lot of interesting work from an IR empirical perspective and a historical perspective in looking at how different value systems have manifested in the public sphere, how there is overlap, how there is difference. And I think interrogating that nuance is going to be key to projecting and communicating values that don't just fall into an old pattern and can resonate with people in terms of the world they're living in, not the world that they inherited. And so I think there is the academic perspective, you have the time, you can have the focus to do just that in certain how they manifested through institutions, through narratives, political, multilateral institutions, etc. And so I think there's a lot of work to do around the nuance of how values have been conceived, projected, and sustained over different periods that are relevant to right now in terms of the international relations transition.
And finding I'm thinking about how important the moments where we agreed on values and could hold each other to actually stand behind the values that we shared. So I guess we're 50 years on from Helsinki, and how important that was that the old Soviet Union signed on to a
Yeah.
basket of values that we could then call on them to honor for their own citizens.
Yeah. And I think it's values informed norms that are
That's right.
politically palatable, right?
Yeah.
Like these are the things where ethics meets realism. And from the council's perspective, we have seen significant progress, fill in the blank politically, right? Geopolitically over the years. And so, um, yeah, there's a lot of work to be doing that. I am also doing, we have this project at the council. I'm doing some academic work on it as well with Jim. So, anybody on the call, drop me an email, ping me on LinkedIn. Always happy to collaborate on this.
Nick, I just have one quick thing to say about that too, as I know we're up against time, but I would say that if you, outside of programs like Nick's and a few others that focus specifically on public diplomacy, my my sense across colleges and universities in the US, that those who are teaching international relations, global studies, even if they're teaching courses specifically on diplomacy, it's far and few between for those institutions to have really any focus at all on public diplomacy. So I know PDCA is working to turn that around, but I think more and more it's the places that aren't doing it that could do it that need some extra attention.
Right. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Kevin. Could I now go to Larry Schwartz for some remarks to round things off? But thank you for a great session, guys.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First, I just want to thank our speakers and also USC's Annenberg Center and GW University, our partners, for working with us together today. Our next program on February 2nd rather will be different than this one. Today, we talked a lot about values and large-scale international relations issues. Uh, next month, we're going to try and talk a little bit about a new program. It's not really new. The uh, the Department of Education's Centers for American Overseas Research Centers have been transferred to the State Department and are now being integrated into the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. The KORCs, or the Overseas Research Centers, are distributed across the planet, and they involve very real connections between academics in our universities, some of the greatest specialists in area studies and in national studies in America, and people abroad. This program has been going on a number of years, and now we need to figure out a way to make this work for us as public diplomacy officers. In the past, the KORCs operated very independently. It's not likely that it will continue exactly the same way under the State Department. But the important point is that as we look to the future of public diplomacy, it will certainly be different than it was in the past. And here we have an opportunity to find ways in which our posts overseas can actually work more closely with these overseas research centers. Jim worked in Cairo, presumably with RC, the most famous, one of the most famous of our overseas research centers. Also, we have a very big one in Italy that's one of the principal sources for the study of arts and the humanities in the world. In Tangier, we have the first American diplomatic uh, center in North Africa is actually held by our overseas research center there. So what we're going to try and do next month is look at these programs, figure out new and interesting ways for public diplomacy to actually work using the strength of the American academic community together with our academic and educational exchanges to advance our foreign policy goals and objectives. And I guess I can say, uh, oh yeah, my job after that is to say thanks to everybody for coming, and
And Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Let's
and Happy New Year. That's right. All right, bye.
thank you very much. Thanks for everybody for attending.